October 24th, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Palawan Passage. Through the morning mist, a massive silhouette cuts through dark waters. The heavy cruiser IJN Atago Pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy leads a formation of 32 warships toward their destiny. On her bridge stands Admiral Takeo Kurita, observing the lightning sky with the practiced eye of a veteran commander. He commands the most powerful naval force Japan can still assemble. 5 battleships, 12 heavy cruisers, 15 destroyers. Their mission is clear: break through to Leyte Gulf, annihilate the American landing forces, turn the tide of a losing war. But beneath those dark water, death is already waiting. In 28 minutes, this mighty warship will become a tomb for 360 sailors. This is the story of those 28 minutes and the 5 hours of silent stalking that came before them. The year is 1944, and the Pacific War has reached its critical turning point. American forces are landing at Leyte in the Philippines. If they succeed, Japan will be cut off from the oil fields of Southeast Asia. The war will be lost, not in months, not in weeks, but in a matter of days. Operation SHO is Japan's answer, a desperate all-or-nothing gamble to destroy the American invasion fleet before they can establish their foothold. The plan is complex. 4 separate forces attacking simultaneously from different directions. Kurita's center force is the hammer, the killing blow, the strongest naval formation Japan has left. Leading this armada is Atago, a ship with a story, a ship with a soul, a vessel that has sailed through 14 years of triumph and tragedy, from the invasion of China to the attack on Pearl Harbor, from the catastrophe at Midway to the brutal battles in the Solomon Islands. 700 men call her home. Veterans who have survived when so many others have not. Sailors who know their craft. Warriors who understand the stakes. But there is a fatal flaw in Operation SHO: no air cover. None. Japan's carriers have been destroyed or stripped of their pilots. The skies belong to America now. Kurita's fleet is advancing into enemy-controlled waters without eyes in the sky, without fighters to protect them, without reconnaissance to warn them of danger. They are sailing blind into the unknown, and the unknown is about to strike. To understand what happens next, you need to know what Atago truly was. She was born in 1930 at the Kobe shipyard, the first ship of the Takao-class heavy cruisers, a symbol of Japanese naval ambition in an era when such symbols mattered. Her statistics told part of the story. Standard displacement, 13,400 tons. Length, 203 meters. Speed, 35 knots. Range, 8,000 nautical miles. But numbers alone could not capture what made her formidable. 10 203mm guns divided among 5 turrets, each capable of hurling 110-kilogram shells to a range of 30 kilometers. Fire control systems that could track targets in darkness. Armor plating that could withstand punishment from smaller vessels. Yet her most fearsome weapon was something else entirely. 8 Type 93 Long Lance torpedo tubes. The Long Lance was not just a torpedo, it was a technological marvel. A weapon that outranged and outperformed anything the Allies possessed. 40 kilometers of range, 500 kilograms of explosive power per warhead, oxygen propulsion that left no telltale wake. A weapon that had devastated American and British ships in the early war years. Atago had used them well. Too well. American sailors had learned to fear the night battles where Japanese cruisers unleashed these silent killers. But by October 1944, the war had changed. Japan was losing. Not slowly, not gradually, but catastrophically. The island fortresses were falling one by one. The merchant fleet was being decimated by American submarines. The carrier force had been shattered at the Philippine Sea in a massacre the Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Still, Japan fought on. Admiral Kurita embodied this stubborn determination. 55 years old, a career naval officer who had risen through the ranks in an era of rigid hierarchy and fierce competition. He had commanded destroyers in the 1920s, cruisers in the 1930s. Now, in the twilight of his Navy's existence, he commanded this massive fleet. His face bore the weathering of decades at sea, deep lines around the eyes from squinting into sun and storm, a mouth set in perpetual sternness, hair going gray at the temples. He carried himself with the dignity expected of his rank, but those who knew him well could see the weight of responsibility in his posture. This was his first major independent command, the mission that would define his legacy. Success could prolong the war, give Japan negotiating leverage, perhaps even turn the tide. Failure would open the road to Tokyo. The pressure was immense, unbearable. Yet he bore it with outward calm. On the morning of October 23rd, as his fleet assembled for the passage through Palawan, Kurita stood on Atago's flag bridge, reviewing the formation one final time. The massive battleships Yamato and Musashi held the center, each displacing 72,000 tons, each mounting 9 460mm guns, the largest naval rifles ever built. These were the super battleships designed to outfight anything the Americans could field. Around them, the heavy cruisers formed a protective screen. Atago leading the right column, Maya on the left, Takao and Shokai following behind. 10 ships in total, each a formidable combatant in its own right. The destroyers darted ahead and on the flanks, 15 ships serving as scouts and submarine screens. Fast maneuverable, but tragically under-equipped for the anti-submarine warfare that was about to be tested. Cruising speed 18 knots, fast enough to cover distance, slow enough to maintain formation and conserve fuel. The formation looked impressive, professional, ready, but it was built on a foundation of fatal vulnerabilities. No aircraft carriers sailed with them. No float planes scouted ahead. No combat air patrol circled overhead. The fleet relied on visual lookouts and primitive radar systems that were years behind American technology. And in anti-submarine warfare, they were catastrophically unprepared. Japanese sonar was outdated. The training was inadequate. The doctrine emphasized surface combat, not the patient, methodical hunting of submarines. Destroyers lacked sufficient depth charges. Crews lacked practice in coordinated anti-submarine sweeps. The Americans knew this. They had been exploiting it for years. At midnight on October 24th, Kurita's fleet entered the Palawan Passage, a narrow corridor of water between Borneo and the Philippine archipelago, a natural choke point, a perfect place for an ambush. The night was quiet, too quiet. On Atago's bridge, officers maintained their watches in disciplined silence. The only sounds were the steady thrum of engines, the gentle wash of bow wave, the occasional murmur of status reports. Kurita gazed out at the dark sea. Moonlight glinted off the water. The silhouettes of his other ships moved like shadows through the night. Everything appeared normal, peaceful even. He did not know that two hunters were already watching. 30,000 yards away beneath the surface, USS Darter was tracking them. Commander David McClintock stood in the cramped control room of his submarine, watching the radar screen with intense focus. The bright dots appeared clearly, not one or two contacts, not a small convoy, an entire fleet. McClintock was 32 years old, young for a submarine commander, but this was a young man's war. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1935, served on surface ships initially, then volunteered for submarine duty when war came. He had been hunting in these waters for months. Long patrols, endless waiting, brief moments of terrifying action. It was a different kind of warfare than the surface Navy knew. Silent, patient, ruthless. The Gato-class submarines like Darter were remarkable machines, 311 feet long. Diesel-electric propulsion allowing them to stay submerged for extended periods. 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft. A crew of 80 men living in impossibly cramped conditions for patrols that could last 2 months. Life aboard was difficult. The heat was oppressive. The air grew stale between surfacings. Fresh water was rationed. Fresh food ran out after the first week. Men slept in shifts, hot bunking, in tiny berths. But American submarines had become the most effective weapon in the Pacific. They had strangled Japan's merchant marine, cutting off the raw materials needed for war production. They had sunk warships from destroyers to carriers. They operated with near impunity in waters Japan once controlled. And now pure chance had delivered the greatest prize imaginable directly into McClintock's sights. He immediately contacted USS Dace, his Wolfpack partner, operating 10 miles to the south. Commander Bladen Claggett received the message with equal excitement. 2 submarines were better than 1. They could coordinate their attacks, cover for each other, maximize the damage. The 2 commanders quickly formed a plan. Shadow the Japanese fleet through the night. Stay at periscope depth. Maintain radio silence except for brief encrypted transmissions. Wait for dawn when visibility would improve. Then attack. This was the wolf pack tactic that American submarines had perfected. Not lone hunters, but coordinated teams working together to overwhelm enemy defenses. From 0016 hours until 0500 hours for nearly 5 hours, Darter and Dace maintained their silent vigil. They moved parallel to the Japanese formation. Starting 10 miles apart to cover maximum area, they gradually closed the distance as they refined their attack positions. By dawn, they had maneuvered to within 1,000 yards of each other, perfectly positioned on either flank of the enemy fleet. Inside Darter, the tension was palpable. The submarine crept through the water at periscope depth, only the thin tube of the periscope and the snorkel breaking the surface. Every movement had to be gentle, every command given in whispers. One loud noise, one mechanical failure, one careless mistake could alert the Japanese destroyers overhead. The temperature inside climbed to 40 degrees Celsius. No air conditioning could cope with the tropical heat, and the massive equipment and bodies packed into the steel cylinder. Sweat beaded on foreheads. Shirts became soaked. The air grew thick and hard to breathe. But no one complained. Every man understood the opportunity they had. McClintock stood at the periscope for hours, only occasionally yielding it to his executive officer. Through the eyepiece, he watched the Japanese fleet, counted the ships, identified their types, calculated their course and speed, range 12,000 yards, target speed 18 knots, course 070 degrees. The numbers ran through his mind constantly. He was calculating the perfect attack position. The firing angle had to be precise, distance close enough that torpedoes would not miss, far enough to allow time to dive after launching. This was not random shooting. This was mathematics, physics, cold calculation married to years of training. Yet there was something the Japanese could not detect. Their sonar systems, primitive compared to American technology, could barely distinguish submarines from schools of fish or thermal layers in the water. Their lookouts, trained primarily for surface threats, rarely looked down at the subtle disturbances a periscope might create. And their doctrine, focused on aggressive surface action, left them vulnerable to the patient stalking tactics American submarines employed. The Mark 14 torpedoes loaded in Darter's tubes represented the culmination of years of painful development. Early in the war, they had been plagued with problems: faulty depth control, defective magnetic exploders, weak firing pins. American submarine crews had watched in anguish as torpedoes passed harmlessly beneath targets or struck without detonating. But by late 1944, most issues had been resolved. The Mark 14 was now reliable, deadly. Each torpedo carried 300 kilograms of Torpex explosive, more powerful than TNT, enough to crack the hull of any ship afloat. McClintock had 6 of them loaded in his forward tubes, 6 chances to strike a devastating blow. As the hours crawled past, he refined his plan. His target was clear: the large cruiser leading the right column, the one with the distinctive pagoda bridge structure. He did not know it was Atago, did not know Admiral Kurita stood on that bridge, did not know this was the flagship of the entire operation. He simply knew it was a priority target, and he intended to sink it. At 4:30, the eastern sky began to lighten. Dawn was approaching. McClintock gave the order: battle stations, load all 6 forward torpedo tubes. Throughout the submarine, men moved to their positions with practiced efficiency. In the torpedo room, sailors performed final checks on the Mark 14S, verifying the gyro settings, confirming the depth controls, ensuring the contact exploders were armed. Torpedo man, second class James Hartley, 23 years old, from Nebraska, ran his hand along the smooth metal skin of torpedo number 3. He had loaded and maintained these weapons for 18 months, had seen them fail in the early days, had celebrated when the fixes finally worked. Now, preparing them for what might be the most important shot of the war, he whispered a quiet prayer. Not for himself, for the weapon, that it would run true, strike hard, do its job. These torpedoes had to work, had to strike true, had to detonate. There would be no second chance. At 0500, McClintock began his final approach. He guided Darter silently across the projected path of the Japanese fleet. This was the most dangerous maneuver, the most audacious. He was positioning his submarine directly in front of the oncoming armada, letting them sail straight toward him. It was the attack technique that promised maximum accuracy. It was also the technique that offered the least room for error. One sonar contact, one alert lookout, one change in the Japanese formation. Any of these could turn Hunter into hunted in seconds. But McClintock had faith in his crew, faith in his boat, faith in his calculations. At 0515, position was perfect. Darter lay nearly motionless at periscope depth, bow pointing north, perpendicular to the Japanese fleet's heading. The setup was textbook, the kind of shot submarine commanders dreamed about. McClintock pressed his eye to the periscope one final time. Through the lens, dawn light illuminated Atago advancing directly toward him. The ship's lines were clearly visible now. Tall pagoda bridge, imposing gun turrets, radar antennas slowly rotating, battle flags flying. She was beautiful in the way warships could be beautiful. Purpose and power made manifest in steel. In moments she would be dying. Range 1,500 yards, 1,400, 1,300. Too close. Torpedoes might not arm in time. 1,200, 1,100, 1,000. Too far. Accuracy would decrease. 980 yards. Perfect. The moment stretched. Time seemed to slow. McClintock could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of decision, could sense his entire crew holding their breath. Everything they had trained for, everything they had endured, every day of every patrol, every moment of waiting and watching and hunting. It all came down to this one instant, this one command. He took a breath and gave the order that would change everything. Fire. The word echoed through the submarine like a gunshot. Fire. The torpedo officer's hand moved to the firing panel. 6 switches in sequence, each one connected to a tube, each tube containing 1,500 kilograms of steel and explosive purpose. The first switch closed, a surge of compressed air, a mechanical clunk that resonated through the hull. The submarine shuddered slightly as the first Mark 14 torpedo ejected from tube number 1. 3 seconds. Switch 2. Another surge. Another shudder. 3 seconds. Switch 3. The timing had to be precise. Too fast and the torpedoes might interfere with each other. Too slow and the target might maneuver out of position. 3 seconds between launches was the mathematical optimum, the product of countless calculations and combat experience. Switch 4. Switch W. Switch 6. In 18 seconds, 6 torpedoes were running hot and true toward their target. Each weapon measured 21 feet in length. Each weighed 3,200 pounds. Each was powered by a steam turbine driven by alcohol and compressed air, pushing it through the water at 46 knots, nearly 85 kilometers per hour. Running time to target 62 seconds. McClintock kept his eye pressed to the periscope, watching, counting. His lips moved silently with the numbers. 1, 2, 3. The torpedoes left no visible wake. They ran at a depth of 3 meters, just below the surface, invisible to lookouts above. Silent death approaching at terrifying speed. 10, 11, 12. In the control room, every man stood frozen. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound was the quiet hum of electric motors and the gentle creaking of the submarine's hull under pressure. 20, 21, 22. This was the eternal agony of submarine warfare. The waiting. After the torpedoes left the tubes, there was nothing more to do. No way to guide them. No way to correct their course. They were committed, running on gyroscopes and preset depth controls toward a target that was still moving, still unaware, still alive. 30, 31, 32. McClintock's hands gripped the periscope handles with white-knuckle intensity. Through the lens, he could see Atago clearly now. Morning sunlight gleamed on her gray paint. Her bow wave pushed white foam to either side. Men moved on her decks, tiny figures going about their morning routines. 40, 41, 42. Did any of them sense what was coming? Did any lookout's eye catch a hint of movement in the water? Did any sonar operator hear the faint whine of torpedo propulsion? Number Atago sailed on serene and unsuspecting. 50, 51, 50-2. 10 seconds remaining. The torpedoes were covering the final distance, racing through the dark water, closing on their target with mechanical precision. 57, 58, 59. McClintock held his breath. 60. 61. Impact. At precisely 5:32 hours on the morning of October 24th, 1944, the first torpedo struck IJN Atago on her starboard side. The explosion was cataclysmic. 300 kilograms of torpex detonated against the hull plating directly adjacent to engine room number 1. The blast created a pressure wave that radiated outward at supersonic speed. Water molecules compressed to densities they were never meant to achieve. Steel buckled and tore like paper. The hull ruptured. A hole 4 meters across appeared instantaneously where solid metal had been moments before. The ocean, under tremendous pressure at that depth, surged inward with the force of a battering ram. Engine room number 1 was a cathedral of machinery. Massive turbines, reduction gears, propeller shafts, pipes carrying superheated steam, fuel lines, electrical conduits, and men, always men, engineers and mechanics who tended this mechanical heart with skills learned through years of training. The water hit them like a solid wall. There was no time to react, no time to comprehend, no time to scream. The pressure alone killed some instantly. Others were swept away by the current hurled against machinery with bone-breaking force. A few stationed near the upper levels had seconds to realize what was happening before the freezing water engulfed them. The compartment flooded completely in less than 20 seconds. 3 seconds after the first torpedo hit, the second exploded. This one struck engine room number 2. Same mechanism, same terrible efficiency, another massive hole, another surge of destroying water, another group of men drowned in darkness. 3 seconds more. The third torpedo. This one hit amidships near the base of the fire control tower. The explosion damaged the main electrical trunk lines that ran the length of the ship. Instantly, power failed throughout Atago. Lights went dark. Ventilation fans stopped. Communication systems died. The ship was plunged into chaos and blackness, and still the torpedoes kept coming. The fourth and final hit came 3 seconds later, striking aft of the engine rooms. Another breach, another flood, another compartment lost. 4 torpedoes, 4 hits, 12 seconds of destruction. McClintock, still watching through the periscope, saw the massive columns of water shoot skyward. Each explosion lifted thousands of tons of seawater into the air, creating geysers 20 meters high that caught the morning light and turned it into brief rainbows before crashing back down. Flames followed. Ruptured fuel tanks spilled oil into the flooded compartments. The oil met hot machinery. Ignition was instantaneous. Fire spread across the water's surface, creating an inferno in spaces that were simultaneously flooding and burning. Black smoke began pouring from Atago's hull. Not from one location, from multiple wounds along her starboard side. The smoke rose in thick columns, marking her position for miles around. Through his periscope, McClintock watched with professional satisfaction. He muttered to himself, barely audible, "We hit a big fish." He had no idea how big. No idea that he had just struck the flagship. No idea that he had put an admiral in the water. No idea that he had thrown an entire battle plan into chaos. He simply knew he had done his job. Done it well. Delivered a killing blow to a major Japanese warship, but his work was not finished. Not yet. He had to ensure his own survival. Had to get Darter away before the Chinese destroyers came hunting. Emergency dive. Take her down to 300 feet. Rig for depth charge attack. Silent running. The commands came quickly. The crew responded instantly. Darter's nose tilted downward. Her electric motors pushed her deeper into the protective darkness of the ocean depths. Behind her, Atago was dying. On the bridge of the stricken cruiser, Admiral Kurita was thrown against the chart table by the force of the first explosion. The impact came without warning. One moment he was standing calmly watching the dawn. The next, the world became violence and chaos. The deck heaved beneath his feet. The entire ship shuddered as if struck by a giant's fist. Kurita's binoculars flew from his hands. Glass shattered. Charts scattered. Officers stumbled and fell. Before anyone could react, the second explosion hit. Then the third. Then the fourth. The lights went out. Total darkness enveloped the bridge. In the sudden blackness, men shouted in confusion and fear. Some tried to reach emergency stations by memory. Others froze disoriented by the loss of vision. Emergency lighting flickered on and after what felt like an eternity but was actually only 15 seconds. The dim red glow revealed a scene of confusion. Kurita pulled himself upright. His first instinct was command. His first word was action. Damage report. Emergency maneuver. All stations report. But the communication system was dead. The electrical power that carried voices through speaking tubes and intercom systems had failed. The bridge was isolated, cut off from the rest of the ship. Staff officers rushed to send runners below, but the passageways were dark, filled with smoke, and already the list was becoming apparent. Atago was tilting to starboard, the side that had been struck, the side where tons of water were flooding in through multiple breaches. Captain Araki Tsutao Atago's commanding officer appeared beside Kurita. His face was grim. He was a career naval officer with 25 years of experience. He had commanded destroyers in the China War, had survived the brutal surface actions off Guadalcanal. He knew ships, knew their tolerances, knew when they could be saved and when they were doomed. He assessed the situation with ruthless speed. 4 torpedo hits, all on the starboard side, all below the waterline. Main engineering spaces flooded. No power, no pumps, no way to control the flooding. List already at 10 degrees and increasing. The ship could not be saved. His voice was steady when he spoke. Professional, accepting of the inevitable. Admiral, I recommend we prepare to abandon ship. Kurita's jaw tightened. To abandon his flagship. To lose his command center. To be cast into the water like a common sailor. It was unthinkable. But he was also a realist. He trusted his captain's judgment, and he could feel the deck tilting further beneath his feet with each passing second. How long do we have? Captain Araki paused, calculated, drew on decades of experience with damaged ships. 20 minutes, perhaps less. The flooding is too extensive. The list will continue to increase until she capsizes. 20 minutes to evacuate 700 men from a dying ship in the middle of a battle zone. Kurita felt the weight of that number. 700 lives, 700 families, 700 stories that might end in the next few minutes. He had commanded men before, had sent them into danger, had written letters to families of those who did not return. But this was different. This was his flagship, his responsibility, his command. For a moment, emotion threatened to overwhelm him. But he pushed it down, buried it beneath layers of discipline and duty. There would be time for grief later. If he survived, if any of them survived, it was not enough time, but it was all they had. Issue the abandoned ship order, all hands to muster stations, get the wounded topside, launch all boats. The orders went out, not through electrical systems, but through human voices. Officers and petty officers moving through the darkened ship, shouting instructions, guiding men toward exits, fighting against panic and chaos. Below decks, the situation was far worse than those on the bridge could imagine. In the flooded compartments, death had been instant, but in the adjacent spaces, men struggled against rising water and failing light. Watertight doors had been sealed as soon as the torpedoes hit following standard damage control procedures. This prevented the flooding from spreading, but it also trapped men in compartments that were slowly filling with water. Some hammered on sealed doors begging to be let through. Others searched desperately for alternative exits. A few sat quietly accepting their fate with the stoic resignation that Japanese military culture demanded. The darkness made everything worse. Emergency lights provided only dim illumination. Many passages were completely black. Men felt their way along bulkheads moving by touch and memory. Some became disoriented in the maze of corridors, turned the wrong direction, found themselves at dead ends. The smoke was equally deadly. Fires burned in multiple locations where fuel oil had ignited. The smoke had no natural escape route with the ventilation systems dead. It accumulated in compartments and passageways thick and choking. Men coughed and gasped. Some collapsed from smoke inhalation before they could reach fresh air. And always the list was increasing. At 0537, 5 minutes after impact, it reached 18 degrees. Walking became difficult, running nearly impossible. Everything loose began sliding to starboard. Tools, equipment, furniture, bodies. In the sickbay, medics struggled to evacuate wounded men. Some injuries were from the torpedo impacts, broken bones from being thrown against machinery, burns from steam and fire. Others were casualties from previous operations still recovering in the ship's hospital spaces. Carrying stretchers up tilted ladders through smoke-filled darkness was nearly impossible. Some of the wounded, understanding the situation, insisted they be left behind. Others fought with desperate strength to reach the upper decks in survival. The crew's discipline remained remarkable. Despite the chaos, despite the terror, despite knowing they were on a sinking ship, most men continued to follow procedures and obey orders. This was the product of years of training, of a military culture that prized obedience and duty above individual survival. But discipline could not overcome physics, could not seal hull breaches, could not pump water from flooded compartments, could not reverse the inexorable tilt of a dying ship. On the main deck, chaos reigned. Sailors emerged from below like souls escaping the underworld. Their faces were blackened with smoke, their uniforms soaked with water and fuel oil. Some were injured, supported by shipmates. Others moved in shocked silence, unable to process what was happening. The lifeboats presented their own problem. They hung in davits along the ship's sides, designed to be lowered when the ship was level. But with Atago listing 18 degrees to starboard, the portside boats hung outward away from the hull, nearly impossible to reach. The starboard boats pressed against the ship's side, jammed in their davits. Some sailors managed to free a few boats. Others, seeing the difficulty, simply jumped into the water. From a listing deck, it was already a drop of several meters. Some landed well. Others struck the water badly, injuries adding to their problems. The fuel oil was spreading. Ruptured tanks continued to leak their contents into the sea. The oil formed a thick slick around the ship, black, viscous, clinging to everything it touched. Men who entered the water became coated in it. It burned eyes, clogged nostrils, made breathing difficult. And then the oil ignited. Fire on water is a special kind of horror. The flames spread across the surface of the oil slick, creating a barrier between the sinking ship and potential safety. Men in the water had to swim through this barrier, had to hold their breath and dive beneath the flames, had to emerge on the far side gasping and choking, hoping they had gotten far enough away. Not all succeeded. Some, exhausted from the swim, surfaced too soon, found themselves surrounded by fire. Their screams were brief, terrible, then silent. Admiral Kurita stood on the tilting bridge watching his men struggle for survival. He had delayed his own departure, ensuring as many crew members as possible had time to evacuate. But Captain Araki was insistent. The admiral had to leave, had to survive, had to continue commanding the fleet. The ladder down to the deck was damaged, twisted by the explosions and the list. Kurita, though 55 years old and not a young man, had to climb down using rope, hand over hand, fighting against the angle of the deck, fighting against exhaustion and stress. He made it, reached the main deck, moved toward the railing. The drop to the water was significant now, perhaps 15 meters. The ship was sinking by the bow, listing further. Every second that passed made the situation worse. Around him, the last of his staff officers prepared to abandon ship. Some tied life preservers more tightly. Others removed boots and equipment that would weigh them down. A few said quiet prayers. Kurita looked back at his ship one final time. Atago had been his flagship for mere weeks, but she represented everything he was fighting for: pride, duty, the honor of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Seeing her die was like losing a piece of himself. But there was no time for sentiment, no time for regret, only time for survival. He climbed over the railing, positioned himself, and jumped. The fall seemed to last forever, wind rushing past, the dark water rising to meet him. Then impact, cold shock, submersion, disorientation. He kicked upward, broke the surface, gasped for air, and immediately realized his situation. He was in the oil slick. The thick black coating covered everything. His uniform, his face, his hair. It stung his eyes. He could taste it in his mouth. Bitter, toxic, suffocating. Around him, hundreds of other men struggled in the same conditions. Some called out for help. Others swam with determined silence. The strongest tried to help the weak. The injured simply tried to keep their heads above water. Flames burned in patches across the slick, creating zones that had to be avoided, dividing the survivors into groups, making organized rescue more difficult. The destroyer Kishinami had broken formation immediately after the torpedo struck. Her captain understood the situation instantly. His orders were clear: rescue as many as possible. But do it quickly. American submarines were still out there. Staying in one place too long meant becoming a target himself. Kishinami approached as close as she dared. Too close and she might suck survivors into her propellers. Too far and men lacked the strength to reach her. It was a delicate balance, a terrible calculation. Nets were thrown over the side. Lines were tossed into the water. Sailors on Kishinami's deck reached down, hauling up oil-slicked survivors one by one. It was exhausting work. Each man weighed far more, coated in water and oil. The nets were slippery. The rescued were often too weak to climb without help. Kurita was among those pulled aboard. Strong hands grabbed his arms, hauled him up the net, deposited him on the destroyer's deck like a landed fish. He lay there for a moment gasping, coughing up seawater and oil. Then training and duty reasserted themselves. He stood, demanded a status report, asked about other survivors, insisted on knowing the fleet's position and status. Even drenched and exhausted, covered in oil, having just lost his flagship, Admiral Kurita was still in command. While Atago was dying and her survivors struggled in the water, another tragedy was unfolding 3 kilometers away. USS Dace, the second submarine in the Wolfpack, had used the confusion following Darter's attack to maneuver into her own firing position. Commander Bladen Claggett had watched Darter's spectacular success with admiration and envy. 4 hits on a major warship. It was every submarine commander's dream. But the Japanese fleet had other targets, other cruisers sailing in formation, other opportunities for glory. Claggett had chosen his prey, the heavy cruiser Maya, sister ship to Atago, leading the left column of the formation, identical in most respects to the flagship. Same displacement, same armament, same vulnerabilities. As chaos erupted around Atago with destroyers rushing to assist and the formation breaking apart, Maya had maintained course. Her captain was disciplined, professional. He understood that breaking formation in a submarine attack could be more dangerous than holding steady, that random maneuvers made collisions more likely, that the best defense was to maintain speed and hope the screening destroyers could find and destroy the attacker. It was the correct tactical decision, but it gave Dace her opportunity. At 0554, while Atago was listing 45 degrees and beginning her final plunge, Dace fired 6 torpedoes at Maya. The range was slightly greater than Darter's attack, the angle less perfect. But Claggett was an experienced commander. His calculations were sound. His torpedo crew was efficient. The weapons ran true. At 0556, 4 of the 6 torpedoes struck Maya along her starboard side. The damage pattern was similar to Atago. Multiple hits below the waterline, flooding in the engine spaces, loss of power, immediate list to starboard. But there was one crucial difference. One of the torpedoes struck directly beneath Maya's aft main gun magazine. A magazine is where a warship stores her shells, hundreds of projectiles, each weighing over 100 kilograms, each filled with explosive, all stored together in a confined space protected by armor plate to prevent exactly what was about to happen. The torpedo's warhead detonated. The explosion breached the magazine's armor. And then the shells inside began to explode. Not one at a time, all together, a chain reaction of devastating power. Hundreds of tons of high explosive detonating simultaneously in the heart of the ship. The blast tore Maya apart. Her entire stern section simply disintegrated, vanished in a column of flame and smoke that rose hundreds of meters into the air. The shock wave radiated outward, could be felt aboard ships kilometers away. The sound was like thunder, like an artillery barrage, like the end of the world. The forward section of the ship, suddenly freed from the weight of the stern, bobbed upward briefly, almost seemed to leap from the water, then settled back down. Already flooding, already sinking. At 6:06, just 10 minutes after being struck, Maya disappeared beneath the surface. There was no time to abandon ship, no time for organized evacuation, no time for most of the crew to even reach the upper decks. Of the 700 men aboard, only 336 survived. Those who had been topside when the torpedoes hit, those lucky enough to be thrown clear by the explosion, those who happened to be in positions where they could escape immediately. 364 died, drowned in the flooded compartments, incinerated in the magazine explosion, crushed by collapsing structure, lost in the chaos and darkness. The destroyers rushed to pick up survivors, but there were so few, and those who were rescued bore terrible injuries. Burns, broken bones, psychological trauma from witnessing such sudden total destruction. In 12 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 2 heavy cruisers to submarine attack. Over 700 men killed, 20% of the cruiser force strength eliminated, and the fleet had not yet reached its objective, had not yet engaged the American surface forces, had not yet even sighted the enemy. Operation SHO was already faltering, already bleeding, already dying. And Kurita, standing on Kishinami's deck watching the smoke rise from where Maya had been, had to decide whether to continue or retreat. Back aboard USS Darter, Commander McClintock was not finished. After firing his 6 torpedoes at Atago, he had taken his submarine deep, standard procedure after an attack. Dive quickly, evade the inevitable counterattack, escape before the destroyers arrive with their depth charges. But as Darter descended into the protective darkness, McClintock reviewed his firing solution one more time. 6 torpedoes launched, 4 definite hits heard and timed. The target was certainly damaged, probably sinking, but 2 torpedoes had missed. This bothered him. Not out of perfectionism, though McClintock was certainly that, but because those 2 weapons were still running, still armed, still dangerous. And the Japanese fleet formation meant they might find targets even if they missed their primary aim. Torpedo running time to complete fuel exhaustion was approximately 15 minutes at combat speed. The weapons would continue until their propellant was spent. Then they would sink harmlessly to the ocean floor, unless they hit something first. The mathematics were inexorable. The torpedoes had been aimed at Atago, leading the right column. They had passed ahead of her bow, missing by perhaps 50 meters. Narrow misses by submarine standards, but misses nonetheless. The geometry of the fleet formation meant those torpedoes would continue on their track, running directly into the path of the ships, following behind Atago in column. The heavy cruiser Takao was third in line, following perhaps 1,000 meters behind the flagship, maintaining formation discipline even as chaos erupted ahead. At 5:34, just 2 minutes after the attack on Atago, the 2 wayward torpedoes found their unintended target. Both struck Takao at her stern. The propeller shafts took the direct impact. Massive bronze screws, each weighing several tons, were torn from their mountings. The rudder, the ship's steering mechanism, was blown completely away. The damage was catastrophic to Takao's mobility, but not immediately fatal to the ship herself. The hull remained intact forward of the engineering spaces. The main machinery was undamaged. The magazines did not detonate, but Takao could not maneuver, could not steer. Her propellers were destroyed. She wallowed in the water like a crippled whale, turning in slow circles, unable to control her heading. Her captain made the only decision possible. The ship could not continue the operation, could not fight, could not even navigate properly. She would have to return to base, slowly, escorted by destroyers, hoping no more submarines found her on the long voyage back. 3 cruisers, 3 of Japan's most powerful warships, eliminated in less than 5 minutes by an invisible enemy. The mathematics of naval warfare had shifted decisively against Kurita's fleet before they had even reached the combat zone. While Maya exploded and Takao limped away, Atago continued her slower but equally inevitable descent toward death. The list had reached 30 degrees by 0550. The ship was no longer recognizable as a vessel designed to float. She lay on her side like a dying animal. Her port side rose high out of the water. Her starboard side was completely submerged. Seawater continued to pour through the 4 massive torpedo holes, flooding compartment after compartment in a spreading wave of destruction. The survivors who had managed to escape were scattered across hundreds of meters of ocean. Some clung to debris. Others wore life preservers and simply floated, watching their ship die. Many were still swimming away, trying to put distance between themselves and the suction that would occur when she finally went under. From the water, Atago's death was visible in terrible detail. The massive hull, usually hidden below the waterline, was now exposed. Red anti-fouling paint that normally prevented marine growth gleamed in the morning light. Barnacles and marine organisms that had attached during months at sea were clearly visible. The perspective was wrong. Unnatural. Ships were not meant to be seen from this angle. The gun turrets, each weighing hundreds of tons, were now tilted at impossible angles. The bolts and mechanisms that held them in place groaned under stresses they were never designed to bear. One turret, the aft, most finally gave way. The massive structure tore free from its mounting and slid down the tilted deck, gouging metal, leaving a trail of destruction before plunging into the water with a tremendous splash. At 5:57, the list reached 45 degrees. This was the point of no return, the angle at which a ship's stability calculations became meaningless. The weight distribution that kept her upright no longer functioned. Gravity had won. The bow began to dip, not quickly, but with relentless certainty. The forward sections were flooding now. The torpedo damage had weakened watertight doors. Seals failed under pressure. Water that had been confined to specific compartments found new paths through the ship. Men still trapped below could feel the change. The angle of the deck shifted. What had been a wall became a floor. What had been a floor became a wall. Orientation became meaningless in the darkness. Some gave up trying to escape. Others fought to the last, clawing their way toward any light, any air, any hope. At 05:58, Atago rolled past 60 degrees. The port side rose nearly perpendicular to the water surface. The red-painted bottom of the ship was clearly visible, the part normally submerged underwater. The remaining sailors still on the ship hurriedly jumped into the sea. But with such a list, the distance from deck to water was tens of meters. Many were injured upon hitting the water. At 05:59, the final minute arrived. The list exceeded 70 degrees. The entire ship now lay nearly completely on its side. Then she began to roll completely inverted. The bottom of the hull, never meant to see daylight, turned toward the sky. The massive propeller shafts were visible. The rudder posts, the underwater hull plating, everything painted red to prevent corrosion and fouling. For a brief, surreal moment, the ship hung suspended, completely upside down. A 200-meter-long steel cylinder floating bottom up in defiance of logic and physics. Then the bow dipped sharply. The stern rose, and Atago began her final plunge. At precisely 628 minutes after the first torpedo struck IJN, Atago slipped beneath the surface. The bow went first, diving downward at an increasingly steep angle. The stern rose higher and higher until it pointed almost vertically at the sky. The massive bronze propellers, which had driven this ship across tens of thousands of miles of ocean, turned slowly one last time in the air. Then they too descended into the depths. The suction was powerful. Water rushed into the void left by the sinking hull. Debris and floating wreckage were pulled downward. Some survivors, despite their efforts to swim clear, were caught in the current and dragged under. They struggled against forces far beyond human strength. Some managed to fight free and resurface. Others did not. As Atago sank, air trapped inside the hull escaped through any available opening. Massive bubbles erupted on the surface, hundreds of them, creating a churning, boiling patch of water that marked the ship's grave. Oil continued to rise. Fuel from ruptured tanks followed the ship down for a time, then broke free and ascended. The spreading slick stretched for miles, black and iridescent, a stain on the ocean that would persist for days. And then silence. The bubbles stopped. The churning ceased. The surface calmed. Debris floated peacefully. Survivors clung to wreckage or swam slowly toward rescue ships. Atago was gone, descending through the abyss, falling through darkness. Her hull imploding as water pressure increased beyond what the steel could withstand. Compartments crushing, machinery collapsing, everything that had been carefully designed and constructed reduced to twisted metal. She would fall for nearly 30 minutes before finally settling on the ocean floor at a depth of 4,200 meters. There she would remain, undiscovered, undisturbed, a tomb for 360 sailors who would never go home. The rescue operations continued for hours. Kishinami and other destroyers crisscrossed the area, picking up survivors from both Atago and Maya. The work was exhausting, dangerous. Every minute spent stationary made the destroyers targets themselves. But Japanese naval culture demanded that no man be left behind if rescue was possible. The survivors came aboard in terrible condition, coated in oil, suffering from exposure. Some had been in the water for over an hour. Hypothermia was setting in despite the tropical climate. Exhaustion, shock, injuries ranging from minor cuts to severe burns and broken bones. Medical personnel worked frantically. The destroyer's sick bays were overwhelmed. Wounded men were laid on every available surface. The decks, the passageways, anywhere there was space. Bandages, morphine, saline solution. All the supplies ran low quickly. There were simply too many casualties. Some men died after being rescued, their injuries too severe, their exposure too prolonged. They had survived the sinking only to die aboard the rescue ships. Their bodies were committed to the sea with brief prayers. There was no time for proper ceremonies. The fleet had to keep moving. Among the survivors was Chief Petty Officer Yamamoto Kenji, age 28, a veteran sailor who had served aboard Atago since 1940. He had been in the forward fire control station when the torpedoes struck. The explosion had thrown him against a bulkhead, broken 3 ribs, given him a concussion. But he was alive. He had made it topside, had jumped into the water, had swum through the oil and fire, had been pulled aboard Kishinami barely conscious. Now lying on the destroyer's deck, wrapped in a blanket, he stared at nothing. His mind replayed the events in endless loops. The explosions, the darkness, the screams of men trapped below, the sight of his ship rolling over and sinking. He thought of his friend, engineering petty officer Tanaka. They had served together for 3 years, had survived battles from Guadalcanal to the Philippine Sea. Tanaka had been on watch in engine room number 2 when the torpedoes hit. Yamamoto knew with absolute certainty that Tanaka was dead, drowned in that flooded compartment, unable to escape. The watertight door had been sealed. It was procedure, the right decision to save the ship, but it had condemned everyone inside. This was the mathematics of survival at sea. Some lived, some died. The decisions were made by physics, in timing, and blind chance. Being in the wrong compartment at the wrong moment meant death. Being 1 deck higher or 1 minute faster meant survival. There was no justice in it, no fairness, just brutal arithmetic. Seaman Nakamura Hiroshi, age 19, had been assigned to the ship only 3 months earlier. This was his first major operation. He had been terrified during the torpedo attack, had frozen in panic until an older sailor had physically dragged him toward an exit. That sailor, whose name Nakamura did not even know, had saved his life. But the sailor himself had not made it out. Nakamura sat on Kishinami's deck, hugging his knees, shaking despite the blanket around his shoulders. He looked younger than 19, looked like a child. His eyes were wide with shock. He kept mumbling the same words over and over. I should have died. I should have died. A petty officer himself, oil-stained and exhausted, sat beside him, put a hand on his shoulder, spoke quietly. You lived because someone chose to save you. Honor that choice. Live well. That is how you repay the debt. Lieutenant Sato Takeshi had been the officer of the watch on Atago's bridge. He had survived because his duty station was above decks. He had followed Admiral Kurita into the water, had helped pull other men from the sea onto life rafts before being rescued himself. Now he stood at Kishinami's railing, staring back at where Atago had gone down. The oil slick was still visible. Debris still floated, but the ship herself was gone, erased from the surface as if she had never existed. Sato was 32 years old, a graduate of the Naval Academy, a professional officer from a family with 3 generations of naval service. He had expected to command his own ship someday, perhaps to reach flag rank as his grandfather had, but Japan was losing the war. He knew this even if he could not speak it aloud. Too many ships sunk, too many aircraft destroyed, too many trained men dead. The Americans were stronger every day. Japan grew weaker. Atago's sinking was not an isolated tragedy. It was a symbol, an indication, a proof of what everyone knew but few acknowledged. The Imperial Japanese Navy was dying. Ship by ship, battle by battle, the end was approaching. Standing on that destroyer's deck, watching the oil slick spread, Sato felt the weight of that knowledge settle on him like a physical burden. They would continue fighting. Duty demanded it, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. On Kishinami's bridge, Admiral Kurita stood wrapped in a borrowed blanket, his uniform still dripping oil-fouled water onto the deck. Around him, staff officers who had escaped the sinking gathered to provide status reports. The numbers were devastating. Atago sunk. Maya sunk. Takao crippled and withdrawing. 696 men dead or missing. 20% of the fleet's cruiser strength eliminated, all before reaching the combat zone. All from an enemy they had not even seen. The flagship was gone. The command center was destroyed. All the communication equipment, the battle plans, the coded signal books, the intelligence summaries. Everything now rested in eternal darkness below. Kurita would have to transfer to another ship to continue commanding. The battleship Yamato was the logical choice. The largest, most powerful vessel in the fleet, well equipped for command functions. But the transfer would take time, hours, during which the fleet would lack centralized control. Some of his staff officers were advocating withdrawal. The losses were already severe. They had lost the element of surprise. American submarines clearly controlled these waters. Proceeding meant risking further attacks, perhaps losing more ships before even reaching the enemy surface forces. The strategic argument for withdrawal was sound. Preserve the fleet, live to fight another day. Do not throw away Japan's remaining naval strength in a desperate gamble. But Kurita knew the larger context. Operation SHO was not just another battle. It was Japan's last realistic chance to influence the war's outcome. The Philippines were the key to everything. Control of Southeast Asia, access to oil and resources, the ability to continue fighting. If the American landing at Leyte succeeded, Japan would be cut off, isolated, defeated not through any single catastrophic battle, but through slow strangulation. The merchant fleet was already decimated by submarine attacks. Fuel was scarce. Raw materials were running out. This operation was the final throw of the dice, the last gamble. If they withdrew, now there would be no second chance. He thought of the men who had just died. 360 on Atago alone. Young sailors and veteran officers, men with families, men with dreams, men who had trusted him to lead them. Their sacrifice had to mean something. Could not be wasted. If he turned back now, they would have died for nothing. The thought was unbearable. Kurita looked out at his remaining ships, the massive battleships Yamato and Musashi still undamaged, the battleships Nagato Kongo and Haruna, 8 heavy cruisers remaining, 15 destroyers. It was still a formidable force, still capable of inflicting tremendous damage if they reached the American transports at Leyte Gulf. The mission was unchanged. Break through, attack the landing forces, sink as many transport and supply ships as possible, force the Americans to withdraw, or at least delay their advance. Lives had been lost, ships had been sunk, but the objective remained valid. The need remained urgent. Kurita made his decision. The fleet would continue. They would proceed through the Sibuyan Sea. They would navigate the San Bernardino Strait. They would reach Leyte Gulf, or they would die trying. He gave the orders. Transfer the command staff to Yamato. Reform the fleet. Increase speed to 24 knots. Implement aggressive anti-submarine zigzag patterns. Continue the operation. The staff officers acknowledged the orders without comment. Some looked relieved. Others looked resigned. All understood the implications. They were committed now. The course was set. At 1000 hours, 4 hours after Atago sank, Kurita climbed aboard the battleship Yamato. The massive super battleship displacing 72,000 tons, mounting the largest guns ever put to sea, became the new flagship. From Yamato's towering bridge, the highest point on any warship in the world, Kurita looked out over his fleet. They were reforming, taking new positions, preparing to continue the advance. Behind them, an oil slick marked where Atago lay in her watery grave. Ahead, unknown dangers waited. American submarines, American aircraft, American surface forces, each capable of inflicting more losses, more deaths, more defeats. But the fleet sailed on, driven by duty, by honor, by the desperate hope that somehow against all odds they might still achieve their objective. What Kurita did not know, could not know as he stood on Yamato's bridge that October morning, was that the worst was yet to come. That very afternoon, 300 American aircraft would find his fleet in the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave would attack. The super battleship Musashi, thought unsinkable sister to Yamato, would absorb 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb strikes. She would fight for 5 hours before finally succumbing. Over 1,000 men would die with her. The attacks would continue all day. Relentless. Overwhelming. The kind of air power Japan could no longer match or counter. Ships would be damaged. Men would be killed. The fleet would be bloodied and battered before ever reaching its objective. But Kurita would press on, through the San Bernardino Strait, through the night, toward Leyte Gulf and the American landing forces. And then in the early morning hours of October 25th, something unexpected would happen, something that military historians would debate for decades afterward. Off the island of Samar, Kurita's battered but still powerful fleet would encounter a group of American escort carriers. 6 small carriers, 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts. Ships designed for anti-submarine work and convoy protection. Ships that had no business fighting battleships. The Americans should have been annihilated. The math was simple, overwhelming, inevitable. But the Americans fought with desperate courage. Destroyers charged battleships in suicidal torpedo runs. Aircraft armed with depth charges attacked because they had no armor-piercing bombs. Carriers made smoke and ran. The confusion was total. And Kurita, exhausted from 3 days of combat, having lost his flagship, and thousands of men, facing what his radar told him was a much larger force than it actually was, would make the most controversial decision of his life. He would order a withdrawal, would turn his fleet around, would retreat back through San Bernardino Strait without ever reaching the transport anchorage at Leyte Gulf, without accomplishing the mission that had cost so many lives. Historians would argue forever whether he made the right choice, whether continuing would have meant victory or simply more casualties, whether the sacrifice of Atago's crew and all the others would have been vindicated or compounded. Kurita himself would spend the rest of his life defending that decision, explaining, justifying, never quite able to escape the shadow of that moment. But on this morning, standing on Yamato's bridge watching his fleet reform, he still believed victory was possible, still believed his ships could turn the tide, still believed the sacrifice of Atago's 360 sailors would have meaning. 28 minutes had changed everything. But the war was not over. The battle was not done. History was still being written. In the darkness below, 4,200 meters down, Atago waited, silent, still, settling into the mud and silt of the ocean floor, her hull broken by the immense pressure, her compartments crushed, her guns pointing at nothing, her engines cold forever. Around her in the wreckage field lay the artifacts of 700 lives, personal effects, photographs, letters never sent, diaries never read, all the small things that made these men individuals, all now scattered across the sea floor. The bodies of 360 sailors remained with the ship, some still at their duty stations, others trapped in sealed compartments, all now at rest in the eternal darkness of the deep ocean. For 71 years, Atago would remain undiscovered, a mystery, a legend, a ship that had simply vanished from the surface of the sea. Then in 2015, deep-sea explorers using modern sonar and submersible technology would finally locate her, would find her broken hull, her scattered debris, her silent guns still pointing defiantly at an enemy long departed. The discovery would bring closure to some families, would answer questions that had lingered for decades, would provide physical evidence of what had been until then only words in history books. But the story of those 28 minutes had never been forgotten, told and retold in naval academies, studied by submarine commanders, analyzed by military historians. A lesson in the mathematics of naval warfare, a testament to courage on both sides, a chapter in the greatest conflict humanity has ever known. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would become the largest naval battle ever fought. 4 separate engagements over 3 days, involving hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of men, losses that would cripple the Imperial Japanese Navy beyond recovery. Japan would lose 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Over 12,000 sailors would die. American losses, though significant, would be far less. The balance of naval power in the Pacific would shift decisively and permanently. The war would continue for another 10 months, but Japan's ability to wage offensive naval operations would end at Leyte. From that point forward, they would fight a defensive battle, retreating, surviving, hoping for negotiated peace that would never come. Commander David McClintock would be awarded the Navy Cross for his attack on Atago. He would survive the war, retire as a rear admiral, and live until 1976 carrying with him the memory of that perfect dawn attack in Palawan Passage. The crew of USS Darter would be rescued after their submarine ran aground days later while pursuing another target. Every man would survive, would go home, would tell the story of the night they sank a Japanese flagship. Chief Petty Officer Yamamoto Kenji would survive the war, would return to Japan to find his hometown destroyed by American bombing, would rebuild his life in the ruins of empire, would never speak of Atago except to say that he had been there when she died. Seaman Nakamura Hiroshi would carry the guilt of survival for the rest of his life, would honor the memory of the unknown sailor who saved him by living well, by raising children, by teaching them about duty and sacrifice in the true cost of war. Lieutenant Sato Takeshi would be reassigned to shore duty, would witness the final collapse of Japanese naval power, would serve in the post-war maritime self-defense force, helping to rebuild what had been destroyed. Admiral Takeo Kurita would live until 1977, haunted by the decisions made in October 1944, by the lives lost, by the mission uncompleted, by the question of whether he could have done more, should have done more, might have changed history if he had made different choices. This is the story of IJN Atago, of 28 minutes that changed a battle, of 700 men who sailed into history, of 360 who never came home. It is a story of courage and tragedy, of duty and sacrifice, of the mathematics of war where human lives become numbers in strategic calculations, where the bravest can fall in moments, where fate turns on timing and chance in the cold physics of explosive force against steel. It is a reminder that every ship is more than metal and machinery, that every casualty is more than a statistic, that behind every naval engagement are individual stories of fear and hope of survival and loss of men doing their duty in the face of terrible danger. The Pacific War was fought by millions, but it was experienced by individuals, each with a name, each with a story, each with people who loved them and mourned them and remembered them. This was the day IJN Atago died. This was how 360 sailors met eternity. This was the beginning of the end for the Imperial Japanese Navy. 28 minutes, from glory to grave, from pride to perdition, from life to legend, from the moment the first torpedo struck at 5:32 until the final plunge beneath the waves at 6 o'clock. 28 minutes that would be studied, remembered, and honored by those who understand the true cost of war at sea. In the darkness of the abyss, Atago rested still, a monument to courage, a tomb for heroes, a reminder that in war even the mightiest fall, and the ocean keeps its secrets forever.